Mr. Robert Borden remains the last Canadian Prime Minister with facial hair. Let's discover the man behind one of the 20th century's finest mustaches. Robert Laird Borden was born in Grand Pre, Nova Scotia on June 26, 1854. His family was poor, and Borden learned about hard work and discipline from his ambitious mother. As a boy, Borden said he had
a more serious outlook upon life.
He worked on the family farm but preferred reading, especially Greek and Latin classics. When Borden was 14, his school's classics teacher abruptly left, and because Borden was such a good student, the principal offered him the position.
I was astounded and horrified to find that in the school calendar I was announced as Professor of Classics and Mathematics.
Robert Borden ended up teaching students his age and older, while still completing his own education and dutifully working on the farm. After teaching in New Jersey, Borden returned to Nova Scotia to become a lawyer. He worked as a law clerk and studied throughout the evenings, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. In 1878, having had no university education, Borden wrote the bar examinations and placed first in the province. Charles Hibbert Tupper, Hibbs, was impressed, and he invited Borden to work at his Halifax law firm. By 1889, at the age of 35, Borden was a senior partner of the firm, and Hibbs had followed his father into politics. Borden represented major clients, became president of the Nova Scotia Barristers' Society, and ultimately ran one of the largest law firms in the Maritimes. He even turned down John Thompson's offer to serve as Deputy Minister of Justice. Robert Borden and Laura Bond met in Halifax in 1886. Laura was an intelligent woman who loved travel. They got married in 1889 and would be happily together for over 50 years. She was
the chief support of my life's labors.
Laura Bond had tremendous social skills and would serve as president on a Halifax Women's Council. They never had children, but Borden's youngest and favorite brother Hal lived with them for years and was treated like a son. Borden met Hibbs and his father at a dinner party in Ottawa. They convinced Borden to enter politics with the Conservative Party. He was elected as MP for Halifax in 1896. Borden didn't like political debates, and before his first speech, he missed his chair and smashed his glasses. Laurie's Liberals decimated the Conservatives again in the 1900 election, so Tupper Sr. resigned as party leader. The Conservative caucus elected Borden unanimously, despite his protests. After 5 years in politics, Borden suddenly found himself leader of the opposition. Over the next 10 years, Borden became increasingly confident in his role as party leader. He began to heal the divisions within the Conservative Party caused by years of short-term leaders. Though Borden's Conservatives lost 2 general elections in a row, the tide started to turn around 1910. Borden's pro-British stance ensured a decisive win for the Conservatives in the 1911 election. Robert Borden became Prime Minister on October 10, 1911. In 1912, Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba each absorbed parts of the Northwest Territories. In the UK, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, was pushing for a larger Royal Navy to counter the growing German power. Borden wanted to finance 3 new dreadnoughts for the British, but his early years as PM saw trouble passing bills due to the Liberal majority Senate. The First World War began on June 28, 1914. Europe was divided into 2 sides, the Allies and the Central Powers. The United Kingdom declared war against the German Empire, and its colonies were immediately involved. Borden passed the War Measures Act, which greatly expanded the government's ability to arrest citizens and control the economy. In 1914, Canada had a tiny navy and a standing army of just over 3,000. Only one of Borden's cabinet ministers had any military history, Sam Hughes, and working with Hughes took
great patience.
Hughes quickly mobilized tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers, but he made many poor, self-serving decisions, and Borden had him replaced in 1916. The first Canadians arrived in Flanders in February 1915. In April of that year, the Second Battle of Ypres took place in German-occupied Western Belgium. The Germans used chlorine gas, causing horrific deaths for many Canadians, but soldiers managed to neutralize the chlorine with urine-soaked rags. Borden first traveled to Europe in 1915. He was knighted, the last PM to be knighted as he abolished the practice as un-Canadian, but he was shut out of war meetings, which didn't sit right with him. Borden traveled across France and England, visiting wounded Canadians in over 50 hospitals. He couldn't believe how many injured young men there were.
The memory of those visits has never faded and will endure as long as my life.
In February of 1916, Borden was working at Parliament on a bitterly cold evening when he heard bells ringing and loud crashes and saw plumes of thick black smoke. Borden raced outside as the flames spread throughout the centre block. Parliament was burning. 7 people died during the fire, including 1 MP, Nova Scotian Bowman Brown Law. The next day, Borden returned to the collapsed ruins. In France, the Somme Offensive was one of the largest and bloodiest battles in history. Between its start on July 1, 1916, and its end in November, there were over 1 million casualties. The Canadians gained a reputation as strong, fierce fighters. Newfoundland, still not a part of Canada, suffered a 90% casualty rate. As the war dragged on, Borden's government exerted more control over the Canadian economy, and they implemented a temporary income tax. These measures were to streamline production toward the war effort and to prevent businesses from more profiteering. The Battle of Vimy Ridge looms large in Canadian history. It was the first time all 4 Canadian divisions fought together. Julian Byng, future Governor-General of Canada, oversaw the Allied forces, and Arthur Currie, a Canadian commander, studied past battles to form his strategies. After days of bloody battle, the Canadian divisions captured Vimy Ridge, but at a high cost. They suffered over 10,000 casualties. It is remembered to this day as a defining moment in Canadian history. Between July and November of 1917, the lengthy Battle of Passchendaele took place in northern Belgium. Arthur Currie protested that casualties would be high for very little gains, but the British command ordered the attack. After a muddy, bloody battle, there were over 15,000 Canadian casualties. When Borden heard about Passchendaele, he was furious. The British military command was still shutting him out.
Is the war being waged by the UK alone, or is it being waged by the whole empire?
Borden was also troubled that as casualty rates climbed, the stream of volunteers had died down. French Canada, for example, accounted for 40% of eligible men, but only 4.5% of recruits. Whereas English Canada had wanted to fight for the Empire, Quebec felt no strong ties to France or Great Britain. French Canadians feared the army, like the country, was increasingly English-dominated. Earlier in the war, Borden had promised,
"There has not been, there will not be, compulsion or conscription."
But he had also promised relief to the soldiers on the front lines. He announced to his party that he was ready for mandatory service. Borden felt conscription was the only solution, even though Quebec and French Canada and Canadian farmers were fiercely anti-conscription. When Laurier refused to form a coalition government, Borden and one of his trusted cabinet ministers, Arthur Meehan, created a new political party, the Unionist Party. This party would replace the Conservatives and absorb liberal politicians who supported conscription. To further ensure his party would win the 1917 election, Borden also put through 2 new bills, the Military Voters Act and the Wartime Elections Act. Women could vote on behalf of relatives or spouses on the front line, the first time women could vote in a Canadian federal election. And immigrants who'd arrived after 1902 lost the vote. This added voters in favor of conscription and removed voters likely opposed to it, such as recent arrivals from Germany or Austria-Hungary. Just over a week before the election, though, tragedy struck in Nova Scotia. A Norwegian ship collided with a French ship carrying tons of high explosives in Halifax and caused the largest man-made explosion before nuclear bombs. The blast utterly destroyed parts of Halifax, and nearly 2,000 people died. Borden immediately traveled to Halifax and made aiding the city a top priority. Though negligence caused the Halifax explosion, locals blamed German residents and imprisoned them. This was a dark part of Canadian history. Here and elsewhere, thousands of foreign-born Canadians, particularly Ukrainians and Germans, were sent to internment camps and treated as enemy aliens. Borden's planning for the election worked. The Unionist Party defeated Laurier's Liberals with a decisive majority. The military service bill was passed immediately, and the first conscripted men started training in January 1918. Riots broke out in Quebec, and Borden sent federal troops to impose order. There were multiple injuries and 5 reported deaths. In June 1918, Borden returned to London for an Imperial War Cabinet meeting, which included UK Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Borden was a hard-working, quiet man, but with hundreds of thousands of Canadians involved in the war, Borden was finished with quietly being kept from war planning. Borden locked eyes with Lloyd George and pointed at him.
"Mr. Prime Minister, if ever there is a repetition of the Battle of Passchendaele, not a Canadian soldier will leave the shores of Canada so long as the Canadian people entrust the government of their country to my hands."
Borden was determined to close the chapter of Canadian subservience to the British Empire. The USA had joined the war in April 1918, and the influx of fresh troops was enough to tip the scales. The weary Allied forces saw total victory on November 11, 1918. Borden returned to London again for peace talks with Germany. He insisted that the Dominions had a right to represent themselves after all their sacrifices. Thanks to Borden, at the Paris Peace Conferences, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India each had 2 delegates, and New Zealand had 1. Borden also got Canadians the right to be elected to the newly founded League of Nations. Canadian officials signed the Treaty of Versailles, and Borden sailed back to Canada. This was progress at a price. As he told Laura,
Canada got nothing out of the war but recognition.
Throughout the war, Borden approached each decision with every ounce of energy and determination he could muster. Exhausted, Borden announced his retirement in July 1920. He chose Arthur Meehan as his successor. For 17 years, Borden and Laura enjoyed retirement, hosting friends and golfing. Laura continued her volunteer work, while Borden tended his wildflower garden along the Rideau and wrote prolifically. He served as Chancellor of McGill University for 2 years and Queen's University for 6. Early in the morning of June 10, 1937, Sir Robert Borden died, aged 82. Over 1,000 World War I veterans lined the streets from his home to All Saints Church for his funeral. He was buried in Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa. Sir Robert Borden is the least formally educated of all 20th century prime ministers, but he was arguably one of the most personally accomplished. He knew at least 5 languages, was primarily self-taught, and is one of the few conservative prime ministers fluent in French. Borden was very serious and studious, and disliked wasting time. Like Alexander Mackenzie, he increased his social standing through hard work, but maintained his simple way of life. Borden never learned to drive and rode his bike to work. Arthur Meehan, in his introduction to Borden's memoirs, said it well. To Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the House of Commons was an arena designed and appointed to his taste. To Sir Robert Borden, the House of Commons was a workshop. By the war's end, over 600,000 Canadians had enlisted to fight overseas. An enormous number of soldiers made all the more staggering with Canada's total population of under 8 million at the time. 125,000 men were conscripted to fight, 25,000 of which were sent to the front. 1 in 3 able-bodied Indigenous men fought in the war. Interestingly, while Borden was PM from 1911 to 1920, he is often referred to as the First World War Prime Minister, even on his portrait in Parliament. Wartime leaders have a hard job, and Borden did what he felt he had to. He asserted Canadian and colonial independence from the UK, but he also alienated Quebec. In Maclean's rankings of prime ministers, Borden is always placed in the second quartile, but his position has been sliding downward. This new series of Canadian banknotes will see the 2 wartime prime ministers' portraits removed. Do you think it's time to recognize new faces in Canada's history, or is this a step towards forgetting the world wars?